welcome back to Beating a Dead Horse. As always, I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And this week, we're returning to the YA well, which means I am already putting money on the fact that this is going to be a very Jackson-heavy episode. But we're actually going to be talking about a movie from YA that we really liked. We're talking about The Hate U Give.
Excellent movie, and an excellent book as well. I dare say one of my favorite books, just flat out. I really, really like it. And the movie was an extremely faithful adaptation, surprisingly so. Maybe to its detriment in some ways, but mostly had everything that I wanted and liked from the book. That's the short of it for me.
Yeah, I have not read the book, I will say. But other than that, I'm pretty much going to echo what Jackson said, just with some slightly different caveats. I really liked the movie overall. I thought every scene worked really well. The acting was very good. There was, thematically every scene connected to every other scene. But I kind of got bogged down by bloat towards the middle. And I didn't mention this earlier in our pre-discussion, but I'm going to mention it now. Towards the end, I got kind of bogged down by what felt like just ever-increasing escalations, and I'm just kind of was like, all right, I'm ready for the climax. Let's wrap this up here now. But, don't mistake what I'm saying here. It was still a very, very good movie. Arguably better than Bad Times at the El Royale, which if you listen to last week's episode, I said is probably my favorite movie of the year. I stand by Bad Times at the El Royale being my favorite movie of the year, but this is a better made, better constructed, better thematically relevant movie. It just has some problems.
Yeah, so I think that the bloat that you're feeling, I guess, before we go into our, spoiler discussion, I think that the bloat that you're feeling is, speaking as someone who has read the book and knowing that it is quite a long book. I don't know the exact page count because I listened to the audiobook version, but it was a very lengthy listen. And I think that worked out in the book's favor that it was so detailed and there were a lot of complex interlocking character relationships and the side characters are really fleshed out. And they included an impressive amount of those subplots in the movie, but the fact that, we have these serial escalations, we have, these climaxes, worked really well for me in the book, and, I still enjoyed it here in the movie, but might be the main contributor to sort of that bloat, and I think that scene to scene, sometimes, you end up getting a little bit of a whiplash, just because they do impressively condense the movie, because not that it's exactly the same as the book, of course. Things were cut, things were moved around. For the most part, I would say the decisions they made in the adaptation were smart overall. But there are occasions where I kind of got whiplash from moments where there'd be a conflict or be something troubling happening, and then it feels like it would just get resolved within the same scene when I, knew that that was kind of a subplot in the book that sort of kept going and got more development. It didn't feel like that all the time in the movie, but there definitely were moments where it simultaneously felt too quick, but also dragged. And I think that was just a consequence of them trying to incorporate everything that people liked about the book, the scenes that would have been really memorable, a lot of those side conversations and diatribes were some of my favorite parts in the book. I've never felt more personally attacked by a work of fiction than during the mac and cheese conversation, so I'm really glad they included that here. If you are a fan of the book, they do have the mac and cheese conversation. And yeah, so all that stuff is great, but I think that might contribute. I think that in order to avoid the bloat, they might have had to change the adaptation a little bit more than they did, which could have worked out. It could have not. But it is what it is, and so what we have here is an extremely faithful adaptation, for better or worse.
Yeah, as I said, I haven't read the book, but I can definitely see where people looked at it and said, we need to keep this scene in for X reason. And in doing so, created a very well crafted scene, just one that continued to extend the length of a movie that's already over 2 hours long. There's just a lot to this movie, and I'm going to constantly bring it back to Bad Times at the El Royale, because despite being just totally different movies, I think really embody my experience with this movie, just because they have very similar run times. And with the El Royale, I was constantly ready for the next scene. Like, I never felt bored. I never felt dragged down. I left in a very, that was a great movie mood. I left in a similar mood from The Hate You Give, but also with a headache and kind of exhausted with the movie at the same time. So I realized how conflicted my, general review of The Hate You Give sounds, because I am basically saying that, yeah, I didn't like a lot of it, but I loved it at the same time. That's kind of the way it has to be for me, is like the sum of its parts are different from the individual, where individually I might not have liked a part, but overall it came together in a very cohesive, well-made story.
Yeah, I'm wondering if some of the exhaustion that you feel, at least, may have been like an intentional part of the movie, just because it's such like emotionally exhausting subject matter. Although I do agree generally with the assessment that it felt a little bloated and too long, just because, I had read the book, and I, interestingly, I'm gonna get distracted with a side note here, but I was, the only person in the movie theater, aside from one, old white lady by herself, who totally I would not expect to be the sort of person to go out and see the movie by herself, no less. Yeah, so I mean, good on her for expanding her horizons, I guess. And I shouldn't be so quick to judge, maybe she read the book at her book club or something. But anyway, yeah. So I was in the movie theater basically alone in the back, and so I occasionally looked at my phone to keep track of the time, just because there were some other things I had to do that night. And kept being surprised at oh wow, we've gone on this long and we're only here, shit. So it definitely felt a little long, which isn't always a great feeling. But it wasn't super detrimental, and moment to moment I wasn't bored, but I think it does yeah, part of me wonders, and again, this is getting into the sort of what we talked about last week with Bad Times at the El Royale. As soon as you start saying, maybe it was supposed to be that way for a negative reaction, that could often be a argument to make. But I think the filmmakers wanted you to be exhausted in some way, just maybe not the way quite that we felt.
Yeah, I've definitely kind of wrestled with that idea in my mind, as I was leaving it, kind of trying to figure out whether I felt the way that a filmmaker might want me to feel, or whether I had gone too far. And I keep coming back to the conclusion that I feel like I went too far for the movie. There was definitely some intentional exhaustion of just I just want this to be over. And I'm kind of at one point I actually did think that. I'm all right, I just want this to end. And I'm kind of oh, I see what they're doing here with that emotion. It's a constant stream of shitty situations, and obviously you want it to end, but then it did go on for another hour, which, sure, once again, it goes back to what Jackson was just saying. Intentional or not, it happened. I was kind of done. It works for a thematic reason, but from a general, is it a good movie? Is it good storytelling? I would argue at that point, no, just because, I left so done.
And it's definitely a different feeling from reading the book to speaking of the adaptation versus the source material, in that the book was a real page turner for me. I didn't have that I felt like I could have kept listening to that book forever, and I usually have a very hard time with my short attention span listening to audiobooks. But with that one, Like, I listened to it basically straight through on a long drive in, like, 2 different sessions, and was just completely hooked the entire time. Like, that drive went by in like a breeze. So, maybe that isn't even the feeling, but for what it's worth, from my point of view, again, as with any time we discuss YA, I must confess that I have a vested interest in YA and promoting YA and, seeing YA succeed because I write YA and I'm currently trying to sell a YA manuscript. Agents call me. But with that said, as someone who writes YA, as someone who reads a lot of it, there are often a lot of tropes, a lot of conventions, and just a lot of little things about it that sort of annoy me. And what I appreciate so much about The Hate U Give is that, yes, it's talking about this, deeply relevant, really important, serious social issue. Like, yes, it's coming from the perspective of a black woman in a very, like, white-dominated industry, and that's important. But I think it wouldn't be the success that it is, if it didn't have so much going on in terms of craft, and so much going on in terms of storytelling and things to set it apart from the crowd. So if you're sitting here worrying, about whether or not you're about to sit through an hour of 2 white guys lecturing you on police brutality, that's not what this is. I'm a lot more concerned about craft here. You could go watch the movie, and the movie makes its themes pretty damn clear and resonant. So I'm here to discuss what I think on the craft level makes it so effective, especially in compared to its contemporaries, because I walked into the movie, I'm working on my second manuscript, which is also a YA novel, and I was feeling pretty shitty about it. I was feeling like, this book, I don't know what I'm doing with it, like, I'm not that excited about the project anymore, but I left the theater for The Hate U Give feeling very invigorated, like, happy that I had just seen a good movie, and a good movie based on a YA book that I really love nonetheless. So this is both going to be, from my end at least, a very long spiel about why I think YA is great and relevant, but also what bothers me about it, that I think future people writing in this genre should, like, take notes from
it's almost like there's a word for that, and I believe it is writers.
Fair enough. Her clearly I'm not a writer. I don't know what words are. But yeah. So that I'm not looking to, like, ruffle people. I'm not here to call out, like, particular authors or whatever. But this is gonna involve me saying some things that might ruffle people. So, YA community, if I ever get my book published, and you come back and you listen to this and I make you mad, sorry. Please don't kill me.
So while Jackson does that, Jackson, inclined that, he will mainly be doing that part. I'll take my side of the episode to more just utter pleasantries and say, yes, good point, interesting point, very, very well put, well placed. Because I don't have as much to say about this movie. I have some thoughts and ideas around it, but as we said, we're 2 white dudes, and our ideas should not be what you go to for regards to this movie. There's a lot of other better people to read, watch, ingest, as opposed to us as far as actual content and theme goes. So go do that instead, and also go support this movie, because you totally should. We need more good YA movies.
Yeah, more good YA movies, more support for like an awesome cast of black actors, black director, have Hollywood, again, very white industry. And so steps can be made to change that. And I think it'd be good if this movie did well at the box office to show that this is important subject matter that people care about and isn't just for, like, a niche audience, that, it's a great movie that deserves to do well. So, yeah.
Well, let's dive into spoilers so that Jackson can speak freely unto his opinions of the YA world.
Oh man. So where do I begin? Well, I have a nice handy dandy list here. And it's tough. Because I think that one thing that like commentary and criticism of this book and books like it sort of fall into is that like these sort of like craft concerns are like ignored or not given like due appreciation. Like it just gets completely attributed to like the subject matter and like oh, like here's like the 4chan argument of like, oh, people only like this because it's a fucking SJW thing or whatever their dumbass logic is. And that's not true. And I'm hoping to sit here right now and prove that's not true, because although like, Black identity is very important, so important that like the main characters even talk about it. I think that it would be a mistake to ignore the wonderful craft things that the book and the movie both do. So I'm going to start off with just Star as a main character, because complaint number one that I generally have about YA is that the main characters of these books are boring, overwhelmingly. They're the same sort of basic-ass white girl. They are the same kind of pretty, but not really, like, kind of plain looking, but everyone really likes them anyway, because, you want people to self-insert, and they tend to be, like, kind of sarcastic and snarky, and, like, that's about all there is to them. And it's really, really played out at this point. It's like everyone saw how well the Hunger Games did and was like, we're going to take Katniss, who wasn't really... I said I wasn't going to call people out, but here I am. But,
Hunger Games is 30 seconds in.
Hunger Games is a big enough target. I feel like that's punching up. So, Katniss herself, and don't get me wrong, I like the Hunger Games, actually. I'm a pretty big defender of it. I think it gets a lot of undue shit, especially from people who, like, aren't involved in the YA world, but, like, Katniss herself is not necessarily the best thing about the Hunger Games. And so, the fact that, like, everyone takes her as the same model for like their main character's personality, especially when it's not like a fantasy world and it is more contemporary and it is more realistic, we don't get a very good sense of like the main character beyond those immediate emotions. Star, on the other hand, has an instantly compelling sort of hook just with her situations, because although she shares, a lot of those traits that I just mentioned, like kind of vaguely sarcastic and stuff, the fact that as a character, she has like a very specific internal struggle going on in that she's constantly code switching, she's constantly like mediating like what she says in front of who, and is never really allowed to feel like her genuine self in front of anyone but her family, like instantly gives her more dimensions as a character, and also makes it so that when she is kind of put through the ringer and has sort of witnesses this horrible trauma and goes through kind of this terrible post-traumatic stress, it feels a lot more like it's happening to a real person instead of just like some sort of trope. And really, that's the best thing about the book overall, is that with the movie, maybe it gets bogged down a bit with the runtime. And, yes, I realize I'm going to be talking a lot about the book in this podcast as well. Sorry, not sorry. But one of the things that I do like about the book is that it is so long. It is that it is so detailed and gives the reader time to breathe and just sort of enjoy the diatribes. Like, there will be, a couple pages in the book about two characters, like, arguing about hip-hop. And it won't really progress the plot always. Like, the title comes from a Tupac quote. So, obviously, that that conversation is important. But, like, there will be other ones where, like, you know, like the aforementioned mac and cheese argument, super relevant to the plot. I mean, not particularly. Like, you can make an argument that, like, having Chris's character, like, try to, like, finger quotes prove his blackness, like, means something to that. But mostly it's just funny. Like, how they're ripping on him for having, like, breadcrumbs on his mac and cheese. Like, it's mostly just fun. And having those moments to sort of breathe with, like, genuine humor and sort of these diatribes and really detailing Star's relationships in addition to her internal thought process, makes it a lot stronger than a lot of these other books, which contemporary YA tends to be very short, very focused on, like, one central relationship. Like, you know, YA is pretty infamously, unfairly, I think, like, looked down upon for being just, like, all romances, like, everything has to have a romances. And yes, there is a lot of romance in the genre, but I think as a consequence, like, maybe one of the genuine criticisms of a lot of YA books is that there is so much focus on the central romance, and whether or not that romance is good, like, you know, in some books it might be, in some other books it might not be. In both cases, a lot of times, like, the side characters will not be as fleshed out. The main character will have, like, a best friend who exists to, like, make a snarky quip and is just, like, a complete, like, cartoon character of a person. Whereas that's not really true in this book, and the movie, I think, does a very good job of capturing that as well. Like, we get a lot of scenes, like, I think one thing that really stuck with me is when King's guys go and they try and, like, do a drive-by shooting at Star's house to intimidate her, and her dad and her brother choose to, like, stay behind. Like, we leave Star's perspective to actually, like, get a moment of them, like, standing together in solidarity to, like, protect their home. And I feel like that's not something that we get with a lot of other YA books, a lot of other YA adaptations. Like, this moment where two side characters, two of the supporting cast, kind of get a moment. And that happens with a lot of the characters, especially in the book. And, I mean, I could continue to prattle on, but Sean, do you want to interject anything?
I mean, not really. I think you're covering, as I said, a lot of this on your side of things. I'll probably, when you wrap up with this element of things, I might talk a little bit about some of the cinematography and stuff I noticed. But for the most part, I will let you say your bit. As I said, the most I can really say is little passing pleasantries to underscore your point. But even that feels kind of superfluous in general, just because you're closer to this media than I am.
Well, I'll get upon my my pedestal and up on my soapbox and prattle on for a little longer then. Yeah, I mean, I'll try and hit mostly the main points, because while we're talking about supporting characters, that's another thing about YA, and this is a pretty commonly observed criticism, actually, so it's not like I'm saying anything new. But the fact that her family in particular is so fleshed out, because that almost never happens in YA. In YA, the family is either dead, like, outrageously, unrealistically perfect, super one-note and, like, quirky, or, like, super overbearingly mean. And, like, especially with, like, parents who are dead and parents who are, like, mean, like, you know, think about, like, the Dursleys in Harry Potter or something. Like, you know, those have their purposes, especially in the more, like, adventuresome kind of stories. Like, you know, we were talking about Darkest Minds, you know, a couple months ago, whenever that was. And, yeah, you don't want, you know, mom and dad sort of dragging around that feeling of, like, kids running around being free. But, again, in these more contemporary settings, even if, like, you know, teenagers don't really acknowledge it, or, like, don't want to acknowledge it, like, their relationship with their parents has a huge impact on their lives. And so I just love that not only is Star, like, a good character, but the her entire family is really fleshed out and gets a lot of focus. I mean, like Maverick, like her dad, he's probably one of my favorite characters in a book. He's awesome. He's got super, like, great depth to him. He's like a great dad, but without being unrealistically so. Like, he's still got his own hang-ups and his own, like, things to work out with. And, you know, his mom, to anger Sean and use my obligatory anime reference for the day.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
You know, Star's mom kind of gets stuck playing like the Chi-Chi from Dragon Ball role. Like, she's kind of the more, like, focused on the family.
Here, Sean, let's talk about this YA novel. It's going to be really good. We're going to talk about things that are, like, important. And, like, it has, like, a deep social message about it. But what's that? Let's talk instead about Dragon Ball Z!
Everything relates to Dragon Ball Z. Everything relates to Dragon Ball Z. But no, like, her mom gets kind of stuck playing the Chi-Chi role, especially in the movie. I think she gets a little more, there are more, like, conversations and stuff, that you kind of see your point of view more. But it's not like she's not a character with her own motivations and depth, too. It's just that, you know, she's the one that, like, wants to prioritize her kid's safety and, like, wants to move out of the neighborhood. And so, like, she really gets into conflict with Maverick over that. But, like, the fact that they have this dynamic and the fact that they have sort of this, like, central question, and I think in the book, you know, it's been a little while since I read it, so this might be, I might be totally off base here, but I think, like, at certain points when they're arguing about whether or not to, like, stay in the neighborhood, I think Star's, like, even worrying about the health of their marriage, and, like, you know, she's really invested in it. And that, I mean, that's a super big thing, like, especially when you're a teenager, like, seeing your parents fight, like, really fight, like, can be sort of scary and will, like, affect your sort of, like, mental state, especially when you're, like, Star, and there's so much going on already. So yeah, like, her family's great. They're all great characters. And that just goes along, like, through the rest of the movie with the, the closest, you know, we have basically, like, a villain in this. We have King. That doesn't happen super often in contemporary YA, but even with him, like, he's like a drug lord, but he still gets moments of, like, showing his motivation, like showing to be more human. Like, he's still the bad guy in the story for sure. But the fact that like, Maverick was tied to him at some point, like makes that those interactions a lot more complex. And it's just, even that relationship, like, there's layers to it, and, like, how Star is, like, intruding on his business, but he has these old ties to Maverick, but he's still willing to be, like, cold to, like, protect sort of his crime scene. It's just really, really, like, impressively, like, complicated character dynamics, and not just for YA. And I think that's ultimately what I love about this book so much, is that it's so unafraid to be itself. It's gonna be super long. It's gonna get into these family dynamics. Like, it's gonna talk about this, like, emotionally exhausting, complicated subject matter. It is gonna, like, provide, like, a role model for, like, younger black readers to, like, sympathize and care about and look up to. It is going to confront white readers with, like, maybe some of the, like, microaggressions or more overt sort of, like, racist things they say and do. Like, I just love, to me, this is YA at its best. This is, you know, taking, sort of challenging kids, like, presenting them with this world, and really asking them to, like, think about their own lives, no matter what sort of position that may be. And I think that the fact that it isn't sugar-coated, that, you know, the book has some really, like, really harsh, really, like, dark moments. As far as the movie adaptation goes, that whole scene of, like, when the central shooting in the novel happens, that staging is just, you know, really tense. Like, we know, just based on what the movie is about, just based on, like, the plot synopsis, we know what's gonna happen, but, like, you still feel it in your gut. And as long as we're on this topic of not sugarcoating, like, I think it's great that the movie has the courage to let Khalil as well be like a complete person, and have like, you know, lots of good things about him and you know, maybe some flaws too. Like maybe he did get roped into working with King, but you know, he had his own reasons in doing so, and what right do we have to judge him for, you know? And that's especially pertinent in the context of how, you know, like black people who are killed by the police are demonized for, you know, things that aren't relevant to the circumstances of the case. But in general, like beyond sort of that extra political layer, I think it's really impressive because in YA, when you have characters whose role in the plot is mostly to die, whose death sort of like kickstarts it, or like a prominent character in the backstory to motivate and like trigger the loss felt by the main character. I think that in a lot of YA books, there's this impulse to show them as like a perfectly pure soul, as like, you know, someone who never did anything wrong, like too good for this sinful earth. But I again, which is why I think it hits home so much harder when like people try to give Khalil shit after his death, and Star ends up like getting mad about it and defending him and saying like, well, why are you only asking me about this? You know, why aren't you asking me about like how we used to play Harry Potter and stuff? And like the scene that got to me the most, and maybe this is just, you know, because of my own background, was the funeral scene, and like having to confront like, you know, seeing him there like as a body, like something. I think that's something that a lot of movies in general, like not just YA in terms of death, like skip over. And one of the hardest parts, I think, is like, you know, having to say goodbye to this person and like see them, as Star says it, as like a mannequin, and not seeing like all the life that was in them. And I think that, you know, we spend a lot of time at the funeral scene, and it's even more dramatic in the book. It's even more of like a heartbreaking scene, and like some chaos kind of breaks out there. I mean, I think that was just a really important element that I don't feel like is super emphasized in other, again, not just YA, but just other movies that I've seen. And I guess I could go on, but I really only want to hit two more points. In general, I want to talk about the aforementioned Harry Potter references, because this is a really personal, like, pet peeve thing of mine, but it seems like every YA book that I've ever read that isn't Harry Potter has to reference Harry Potter at some point.
I'm pretty sure Harry Potter references Harry Potter. Like,
well,
he's the main character. You can't have it not reference Harry Potter.
Well, you know what I mean. But yeah, so like every other YA book has that scene where people talk about like, and again, this is mostly, when I say YA, I'm falling into a trap here, because it is annoying how like YA gets painted with such a broad brush, even though it's a demographic. Like, there's a lot of different genres and stuff within it. So I'm mostly talking about like contemporary romance, contemporary drama YA here, and not so much the Hunger Games-y, you know, Darkest Minds, that those sort of more fantastical dystopian sort of things. But every contemporary YA has to have a scene of the main characters like having some sort of discussion or argument about Harry Potter. Like, oh, I'm totally a Hufflepuff, lol. And it always comes across to me as such like, how do you do, fellow kids, on the part of the writer, just because even though I write YA, I try to be in the know about like what Gen Z is up to, considering they're my target audience. But I am a millennial, I am not in high school, and I don't have regular contact with too many teenagers. So, you know, this could be a totally off-base assumption on my part, but I think it's a reasonable question to ask. Do kids today even care about Harry Potter? Because it was a big thing for our generation in the same way that like Star Wars was a big thing for our parents' generation. That was sort of the cultural zeitgeist equivalent. And yeah, like that a lot of people in our generation like Star Wars too, or more. Like I was more of a Star Wars kid than a Harry Potter kid. But like, I feel like So I don't doubt that Harry Potter is still like a cultural institution and that it's still popular and read, but I don't know if people obsess about it the same way that like maybe people who grew up as the books were coming out like did. That's just conjecture from me, but it's something I always wonder about. And however, this book references Harry Potter too, and it's not just to have a scene that's hashtag relatable. It serves a so much greater purpose than that. Especially, I think they actually expanded on this in the movie. Like, I don't remember the wands. Like, I don't remember Star taking Khalil's wand from his, drawer at the end. Which was a really emotional moment. And why that is that, because, this is coming from such a particular perspective that we don't often see in YA because of how white the publishing industry is, we get exposed, as a white reader speaking, to a more, to a different interesting take on it when Maverick's talking about Harry Potter. He's like, yeah, it's all about gangs, look at this. And it's not the kind of thought that I would ever have. So it's just more interesting on its face than the third 300th lily white person to make a Harry Potter reference in their YA book. But also it goes beyond just being new or different for me as a reader, but it really ties back into the themes of how Star has these friends who she used to play Harry Potter with. And, in these other books about the white kids, it's just accepted that this is gonna be a cultural happy moment for them, but it's tinged with so much sorrow here because Star has bore witness to this violence, and that even though she and her friends did enjoy the same things as children as that the white kids were able to, they had to grow up faster, or Star did definitely as a result of witnessing this violence, both inflicted by the state and within the community. So, there's something tragic about this loss of innocence beyond just the typical YA, coming of age novel, it feels it's a very real detail to include, and I think a very important one. And I think that's what makes it so emotional when, she gets the wand at the end and Khalil's denying that he still has it. And I think the reference is actually doing something aside from being the Ready Player One, remember King Kong, remember Darth Vader sort of thing.
So, what I was going to say, just kind of jumping off that, though, is the basic summary of what I'm getting is that it's taking these conventional tropes that the YA, I guess, universe, for lack of a better term, has come to rest on and using them in new and interesting ways. I constantly refer to tropes and whatnot as shorthand, and it's taking the shorthand so you quickly understand what they're trying to get at, but then twisting it in a totally different way to shake up your expectations right as soon as you're all right, it's Harry Potter, I get what they're, never mind.
Yeah, no, exactly. And part of me, I say earlier that I don't want to pigeonhole these things as just it's different, it's new, it's exciting because it's this book is about black people as opposed to white kids, but it's still important to acknowledge that that's a huge important part of what makes the book special, the identity of the main character and of the writer. Again, that's what Star says to Chris, she wants him to see her as a black girl, and that's important to her as her identity. And the writer on Twitter, Angie Thomas, I follow her, and she'd even said hey, if you're a white person who enjoyed my book and learned a lesson, great, but I didn't write it for you. I wrote it for all the black teenagers to really connect and relate to. So I mean, here what we're just seeing is I think that having that perspective, not alternate perspective, that makes it sound away from the norm, but a more diverse publishing industry inherently will just bring these different takes on things and make it feel less tropey and homogenous. But also, I just gotta give Angie Thomas some credit for taking this tired ass reference that every YA book makes and make it actually thematically relevant. Like, I don't think she did it on accident. And yeah, so I think that's great. And I guess the last thing I want to say before I get down off of my soapbox here about why this book is so great in comparison to other YA is that
Are you sure it's good?
What?
Are you sure it's good? Like, it's been about 30 minutes at this point. I just want to make sure that we're still on the right path here. It's good?
Well, here's the plot twist, Sean. It's actually terrible. I fooled you. No, it's good. It's great. It's one of my favorites, actually. So one of the other things I wanted to mention was the love interest, because Chris is that I think he's a great character, because he's dorky and kind of cringy as the rest of the white kids are, but like, that's the point, right? Like, you know, if we're not cringing at, like, how the white kids are trying to be black and, like, making fun of Star for, like, being black, then, like, that's a huge part of, like, her struggle, so it's important. But also, like, the fact that he's, like, a well-meaning doofus, that, like, it doesn't excuse maybe some of the, like, less educated, less informed thing that he says, it's still, like, shows that he's trying. Like, I've heard other people say, I wish I could remember, that, like, he's a good portrait of, like, a flawed ally, like someone who's trying to be an ally and, like, maybe not figuring it out yet. So he's a good portrait of that. But also just, like, with his dynamic with Star, in that I think, even though it's still definitely her story and, like, overwhelmingly we should and are, like, on her side, like, there's definitely, he definitely ends up being a fleshed out character on his own too, and not just, like, a prop. Like, you understand, like, why he might be frustrated that Star kind of hides so many aspects of her life from him, just as you understand why Star hides those things in the first place. And, like, watching them navigate that relationship and, like, eventually, like, come to understand each other more just feels so much more satisfying than a lot of other YA romances where the problems in their relationship are maybe more forced, like, maybe more dependent on, like, misunderstandings and coincidences and melodrama, and not in, like, a real, like, this is an actual obstacle to our relationship sort of way. And so, when they do sort of resolve it, and they do, kind of stay together and be, like, for the most part, like, a healthy, good couple, like, it's satisfying to see them, like, working out, if not necessarily, like, overcoming these things, like, making an attempt and, like, understanding each other. I think it's a good romance, especially in the book. I again, I'm a little biased. I don't know how it comes across in the movie without that extra background knowledge. I can't separate the book from the movie at this point, especially since it is such a faithful adaptation. However, the last thing I wanted to say, and then I'll get down off my soapbox, is the setting. The setting is really good and really fleshed out. Like, a big focus is on the community and, like, through the side characters. You really feel that. And again, it's not like Angie Thomas, like, sugarcoats any of the bad stuff that goes on in this community, but it's not like a caricature. I mean, obviously it's not like a caricature, because that would be, like, counterintuitive to the whole point, but it's not like the ghetto that you see in other movies, like, ooh, we don't want to go to the bad neighborhood where only bad things happen, and it's like Fallout 3 all the time. Like, no, like, we're not shirking away from the fact that, like, this violence, these shootings do happen in Garden Heights, but Garden Heights is still also a really community-focused place, and, like, people keep in touch and care about each other and come together, and, that's sort of the ultimate point at the end, when everyone stands up to King after setting fire to the Carter store, and, like, come together to help them rebuild. And it's just a great, really detailed, really well thought out setting. Especially when contrasted, you have that nice contrast with kind of the vapid fake white person prep school. And the problem with the setting and most other contemporary YA is that they take place entirely at the white prep school. There's no detail or character given to the setting. They just are rich white kids in a suburb, and it could be any suburb. And it's boring, and Garden Heights is more interesting. And I think that's another thing. Again, I'm pulling from the writer's Twitter again. But I believe I read a tweet from her that said like that she purposefully didn't give Garden Heights like a city or like a state location in America to like give the feeling that like events like this could happen anywhere in America. And I think paradoxically, that's sort of like, even though it does feel very fleshed out and very specific, that sort of generalism also really helps with like the political point, because I think, if we're talking about politics, especially when I was younger, and I only really, and like I had noticed this for a while, but often people from the north, like from the northern part of the United States, above the Mason-Dixon line, will like make fun of the South and say that like, oh, the South's so like terrible and racist, when actually it's more complicated than that. And there's definitely like a lot of terrible racism in the North too, and that like a situation like the one Garden Heights and its people find themselves in like is an American story. Like it doesn't really matter what state you're in. And so I think that was just really smart, having that perfect balance of the general and the specific to make a really rich setting while also making a great thematic and political point. And I really love this book. You should read it, and I like the movie, and then you can go watch that, and you'll have a great time.
Oh my god, there's two of us in this podcast. Holy shit, Sean's back.
I'm so sorry. I know I just got on my soapbox, but I had to.
No, you're good. I think that's an interesting, I feel like even if it's not necessarily the most, thematically relevant to the podcast itself, I think we do a lot of times get more into the narrative of storytelling with movies and podcasts. A lot of times it's, more related to how it relates to death and whatnot, but sometimes in cases like this where diving into those themes would lead us into situations where, as two white dudes, we aren't necessarily super well equipped to handle. So we'll tend to focus on other story elements from it and like how things work around. I think we did a lot. I think you did a very good job of demonstrating the strength of story elements that come across in the YA, and like I just don't have much to add in that regard. I will add just really quick that I really liked what the stylistic choices that they had of washing out, like literally causing the colors to wash out when Star was at the white prep school. I thought that was kind of just like a neat little subtle thing that they did that's a pretty easy thing to miss. But I mean, that's my big thing from this movie. Honestly, I know I said I have things to talk about, but that's my big, cinematography element of it.
No, that's good. I mean that's a good point, because the other thing that I noticed is that like in certain scenes, like especially at the end when she tells off her like dumb blonde friend with like the hairbrush and like completely owns her. She's like wearing a white hoodie and like puts the hood over to like, show that like she's trying to fit in, and like, that might be the kind of thing that again some people might roll their eyes and be like, ugh, like it's so obvious, like blah, like black and white symbolism. But I mean, that's the point. Like the point of this movie is like a call to action and getting you to see that there is a problem. So even if it's not subtle, and again, like I think that I'm not comfortable saying that it's not subtle as like a white dude, because I'm sure that there are like, tons of little like coded moments that I missed that were like, again, not meant for me to notice, but even entertaining the idea that it were, that's the point, that you notice that there's a problem. Right. So
like the idea, of course, is that it's very easy as in a position of privilege to overlook these issues. So like sometimes you just have to have it shoved in your fucking face. Like, hey, it's obvious. when you put it like this, look at it like this.
No, and because like I had come to this conclusion because I was thinking about it in terms of the fried chicken scene where again, the dumb bitchy friend like makes that fried chicken joke to Star, and like the moment before, like it really slows down and really zooms in, and like that's what they're eating, and it gets a lot more focus. Because I think in the book it just comes out of nowhere, like she just says that, and it's a lot more shocking. Like, why would you ever say such a thing? And like I think that's how how she handled it in the book. I'm not positive. Again, it's been a bit since I read it. But like at first I was like, I'm not sure how to feel about this. Like, yeah, like the scene is coming. Like maybe we get it. But again, after giving it some thought, yeah, sometimes you just need to hit your audience over the head with like, look at this problem, look at this racist thing that is happening, especially because there are plenty of microaggressions and stuff presented in the movie that like you can, you have that balance. You have it's a balancing act storytelling. You're like a magician. You're putting on a show. You got to show them one thing to point their direction to another and misdirect them from this. It's great. I'm biased because I'm a writer.
I mean, I got really, as I said, nothing a whole lot to say about this movie. I think that there are conversations that this movie brings up, and I think that everyone should have these conversations, but you should not listen to two white guys have these conversations, because that's not where you should get your information from. You should have the conversation with friends, family, and then people who are more in touch with the experience than we are, because we don't fucking matter in this instance.
No.
Like, plain and simple. There's no shame in that. We are who we are, and we are not people equipped to talk about this.
Is it questionable that I even suggested as two white dudes that we talk about this in the first place? Absolutely. Did I want to do it anyway because I love the book and love the movie? Absolutely. So there you have it.
As per usual, and basically with everything we've ever done, it is Jackson's fault.
I am the harbinger of disaster. I'm sure that I have. I guess as a second disclaimer, if this theoretical like novel manuscripts are ever real books that the public can read, I'm not saying that I'm immune to any of the criticisms I just made of the YA genre. Like, it's stuff I want to avoid, but like,
so lynch him for his hypocrisy.
You can do what Sean said, and take me down for like my own hypocrisy and like point out the moments where I have like a shitty setting or like boring flat side characters. But maybe I'm just one guy, one very stupid guy. So.
Who somehow managed to tie this fucking movie back into anime. That should really tell you all you need to know about Jackson Keller.
I'm here to bring the good people of Earth their anime tie-ins. I'm here to be the bridge between weebs and normal people.
We're ending this podcast here. I've been Sean McKinda. You can find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda. You can also check out my website, isortof.com. There's a bunch of stuff going up over there. Go check it out. There's also got like links to my Twitch stream and all that good stuff. So if you want to come watch a Twitch stream, you can do that. We play Jackbox a lot, so if you want to actually play, you can also do that too.
And I'm Jackson Keller. You can find me over on Twitter at JacksonJKeller, where I don't go. I keep saying I'm going to set up like an ask.fm. Still haven't done that. But hopefully one of these days I'll be able to direct you.
Just fucking make them do it after we finish this podcast. So next week.
Yes, I'll do it right now. And then next week it'll be great. Tremendous.
There you go. So if you have questions for Jackson, wait till next week. Write them down.
Agents hit me up.
Exactly. There you go. Agents hit up Jackson. If you want to follow the podcast, you can at BADH_cast. If you do have a present question for Jackson or anything like that in the meantime, you can always tweet at the podcast. I am running that account, so I can always forward it on to Jackson if it's super important. As always, shout outs to Lords of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide, alternate take off the album High Octane, Low Expectations. And huge shout outs to 25yearslatersite.com, because once again, this is an episode that I'm not ashamed to put up on their website. It's like competent, and there's themes and messages and an analysis of a property and movies and all that stuff. What a concept. What a concept.
The universe. What a concept.
Next week, we're going to be doing something a little bit special. It is still October, despite the fact that we did our first October thing 4 weeks ago at this point. So next week, we're going to wrap it up with my October pick, which is Over the Garden Wall, a cartoon that aired on Cartoon Network like 2012. It's all available on Hulu. If you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it. It's very, very good. It's going to actually get released on Halloween Day, so be prepared for that, probably somewhere around noon, 1 o'clock Eastern time. It's a fucking great show, and it's a way that this podcast forces Jackson to watch it. So,
be there or be square.
You are going to wallow in that. Bye.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go